Yo, what's going on, Narwhals? This is Mr. Cantwell, and by the end of this lesson, you should be able to answer these three questions. What is plot? What is setting? And what is a protagonist? I don't think most of that stuff is new to you guys, but we got to do a refresher. So taking a look at the first piece, I want you guys to think about being in an elevator. Usually you're only in an elevator for what, 15, 30 seconds? Well, think about that frame of time and pretend somebody asked you to explain the entire plot of a really famous movie or story or fairy tale or something. I'm going to actually ask you to think about Cinderella. How would you explain that? Well, if you were just in the elevator for the 20 or 30 seconds and you had to crunch down all the events of the story into just that block of time, you might say something like this. Cinderella is mistreated by her stepfamily and she's forced to do all these unfair chores. Her life seems pretty hopeless, unfortunately, but she gets some magical assistance one day to attend a ball. She meets a prince and ends up falling in love with that prince, but she's forced to leave without the prince knowing who she is. Then the prince uses Cinderella's lost glass slipper to try to track her down, but Cinderella's stepmother tries to stop the prince. Ultimately, though, the prince does find Cinderella. He uses this other slipper to prove that it's her, and things are happily ever after. Maybe our elevator doors just open right then. And what I just gave you was an explanation of all the major events in Cinderella, or the plot. When you hear plot from now on, all you need to think about is the major events of a story. The plot is this series of events in a story. Next thing we're going to take a look at is setting. So setting is the time and place of a story. So it's when the story takes place as far as like in history, and also where it takes place geographically, all from country all the way down to the specific building they're in. That could be described as the setting. Now, the setting's important to think about because depending on where your setting is, it changes a whole bunch of things the characters might run into and conflicts that the characters might be in. For example, think about a situation in space. If the setting was space, there would be very different conflicts than if the setting was in a middle school. In space, you might expect a astronaut or whoever's up there, an alien even, to bump into space problems and space conflicts. Maybe the ship breaks down. Maybe they discover something new. But if the setting was a middle school, well, you wouldn't expect there to be the discovery of a new planet as a major plot event in a middle school. A middle school is probably going to be more of a conflict-based thing. Kids getting into disagreements with teachers, things like that. Another really important thing to consider with setting is the time of the story. And it's not just time in history, which is usually how you think about it. It's also major events that have happened before that affect everything going forward. For example, if a story takes place in the aftermath of a war, well then, yeah, a lot of the things that are going to happen in the story are going to change as a result of that setting. So you got plot, which is the series of events in the story, and then you have setting, which is the time and place of a story. In Cinderella, we can take a look and see that we know that because of details in the plot, we know that this is something that took place maybe 500 years ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, but we definitely know it's history. We also know that there's castles and there's princes and princesses, which tells us, yeah, that doesn't really happen today, so it has more reason to think that it's history. And we know that there's kings and queens. All these details, they tell us the time and place of the story, and they also enable the conflict. If Cinderella was a modern day story, it would be difficult to have a prince character. It would be difficult to have no kind of authorities coming in and checking in on Cinderella to make sure she's okay, because that's how our world works now. So we have plot and setting. And now we're moving on to what might be the new one for you guys. It's a big fancy word. Protagonist. Protagonist really just means the main character of the story. Usually, especially in middle school and elementary school, it's pretty easy to identify the protagonist. It's the character in the story that most of the events follow. Sometimes the protagonist is the narrator, the person telling the story, and they might say, I experienced this, I did this. Sometimes it's a third person narration where the narrator is just watching the protagonist do things. So in Cinderella, we end up with a character who the whole plot follows her transformation from being in a tough situation, bullied by her stepfamily, to moving on and ultimately becoming a princess. An easy way to identify the protagonist, if it isn't easy to identify them, is to think about who changed the most in the story. Usually a character starts off one way and then the events of the plot happen and then they change as a result of it. And the character that you follow the most, the one that you hear the most reasons for why they do things or the most reactions to things in the plot, well, that's the protagonist. Now we're going to take a second, and I want you to stop and think. You might even pause this video right now and ask yourself, well, for the Ravine, who was the main character? What was the setting? And what were the major plot events? You might want to hit pause right now. If you can identify those three things, you were paying attention to the Ravine and this little lesson. So what I have for the Ravine is we have our main character, our protagonist, Vinny. Vinny was the one that showed up and he ended up not jumping at the end. We'll get to that in a second. The setting, the place and time of the story was a ravine in Hawaii. They were right near a cliff jumping spot. Here's a big word, contemporary. Contemporary really just means that it could happen like now. It isn't something that takes place so far back in history that it changes the technology that's available. So contemporary really just means it could happen today, maybe even back to like 20 years ago, contemporary. And another major event relating to the setting, the time of the story, is that it does take place 2 weeks after a boy's death at the Ravine. That's really important to the plot because it puts all these doubts inside of Vinny's head. And then we have our very super basic plot breakdown here. Vinny goes to the cliff jumping site, but he doesn't intend to jump. He feels pressure to, and he even climbs up and he almost does, but ultimately he doesn't and he feels peace. If I was in a very short elevator ride, I could have given you that brief explanation of the plot right there. All right, Narwhal, so we're back to our starting slide. You should be able to answer these three questions. What is plot? What is setting? And what is a protagonist? If you can't answer those questions, do me a favor, stop this video and either jump back and watch the whole thing again or find that spot again and watch that. Thanks for tuning in.